Thank you for joining us for Dodging Pitfalls when Running a Community Meeting. I'm Andy King with the Corporation for National and Community Service in Washington, D.C. I'll be your host. Joining us are Bethany DeSoblin and Joanne Lau, our producers at Education Northwest. They've helped to prepare today's webinar and will be managing our technology. You'll see them and me in the chat and the Q&A to help address questions that you may have during the session. And I'll mention, if you haven't had a chance yet to view our two-part short videos on planning a community meeting, I invite you to do that. You may want to take a look at them after this session, and we will post the link to those in the chat for you to review. Let's take a look at our goals for the session. By the end of the webinar, we hope that you'll be able to, first of all, apply meeting management tools and practices at the opening of your meeting and at the end, that you'll be able to identify 5 common pitfalls of meetings that can get in the way of reaching your goal or outcomes, and finally, that you'll be able to learn and utilize pre-meeting planning strategies as well as some on-the-spot responses to address these meeting pitfalls. We've got some tremendous talent in the house with us today. Ryan Fewens-Bliss is a National VISTA trainer, so some of you may have met him at a pre-service orientation. He's also the Deputy Director for Community Investment at the Michigan College Access Network. Ryan has managed both VISTA and AmeriCorps state programs, and previously he served local, state, and national nonprofits and educational institutions as an independent consultant. Ryan has also served as an elected official, elected township trustee in Michigan's Bath Charter Township, and he currently serves as an appointed member of the Bath Township Public Library Board of Trustees. So Ryan, take it away.
Thanks, Andy. I'm really excited to talk to you all today about running community meetings. This is a tool I have a lot of experience with as both a nonprofit practitioner and an elected official. First, I want to thank you all for participating in our opening poll question. It's really helpful to know what you might be using community meetings to achieve during your year of service. You should see the poll results on the right-hand side of your screen now. We can see there's a good mix of folks using the different strategies, different outcomes for community meetings, really spread across the board, which is exactly what we expected to see, as community meetings are a tool that can really solve many different problems. You should also see on the screen on the left-hand side some of the primary reasons you may have to host a community meeting. Those are all the options you had in the poll, plus a few others as well. To discuss an important topic, to make a decision, to plan an event or program, to seek advice, to update, communicate about an issue, to problem solve, and to build or maintain a relationship. So all of those involve other people needing other people's feedback or giving other people feedback or information about a topic. I'm sure there's other reasons too. This certainly isn't an exhaustive list. And for those of you in the poll who said that you don't foresee yourself having to host a community meeting, I'd really recommend taking a peek at your VAT again and comparing it to this list on the screen. Perhaps a community meeting is actually the right tool for your VAT objectives and you just didn't know it yet. Hopefully by the end of the webinar you will. Today our focus is going to be on community meetings, which means for our purposes at least, it's a gathering of community members of 25 or more people who haven't been convened as a group before, meaning this isn't a standing meeting that you host, and the participants probably don't know each other well. You may host the meeting, meaning you're the one running the meeting, or you may just convene the meeting, meaning you set the meeting up with a separate facilitator who's actually running the meeting. That's our working definition for the day. That doesn't mean that some of these concepts can't be applied elsewhere. In fact, they definitely can. But I think it's helpful for us all to be on the same page on what we're talking about today. We'll also touch on some facilitation techniques during the webinar, but we by no means are able to cover the very large topic of facilitating meetings. Check out the VISTA campus, though. There are some really great resources on that topic and other external trainings you can participate in. I think it's really helpful to start at the beginning. So you've spent some time thinking and planning your meeting, and the big day has arrived. So how do you get started? I always like to have some food at my community meetings. It really helps people feel welcome, and gives people something to raise their blood sugar so they're in good spirits for the work ahead of us. At the very least, I try to have bottles of water and coffee for folks. You can't imagine how far these food and drink items go for you. I recommend laying out the materials that you've prepared. If you've prepared things beforehand, things like your printed agenda, any other handouts you have, so that as people enter the room, they can grab a copy of each, fill their plate, and sit down. Typically, I see people nibble on their food and chit-chat with their neighbor while they're perusing the materials you provide, so they're getting prepped for the meeting. Give people a warm welcome to start the meeting. Make them feel appreciated for taking the time out of their day to spend it on your topic. Remember that people's time is really, really precious, more precious than money in many cases. So the fact that they're giving that time to you in support of the issue is a gift that really should be recognized directly. And then take care of any housekeeping items right away. Those are things like the location of the bathrooms, which is always important in any meeting, any parking validation instructions, where to hang your coats, things like that that people will want to know in order to settle in and focus on your meeting. It's always important to do introductions at your meetings, as long as the size of the group is manageable. So again, we're talking about 25 people here, and that's pretty manageable. I try to give very specific instructions around introductions. I ask people to be really brief, and I give them direction on what to say. Usually it's their name, their organization, their title, those types of things. This is a place I might even throw in an icebreaker too. I like to make my icebreakers topical. So if I'm hosting a meeting, say about an environmental issue, I might ask people to name their favorite park as part of the introduction. One thing to note, though, is that people always take longer than you expect in introductions, so you've got to ensure that you've built in enough time into the agenda to actually do the introductions. I try to keep people to 1 minute each, but even with 25 people, that's almost a half an hour of your meeting time just for introductions. So if the group is too large to do introductions, I use name tags or name tents to get people more familiar with each other and learn each other's names. After the introductions are done, I like to review the agenda and the purpose and the intended outcomes of the meeting. It really sets the stage for what we're about to do in the meeting. I always ask if folks have anything to add to the agenda as well. It helps make them feel like they're part of the process rather than just a participant in the process, and it's a great way of sharing leadership with them. And then finally, it's actually time to jump into your meeting content. So what I've just laid out for you here is my favorite way to start a meeting, a community meeting specifically. I'm sure there's many other examples that work well as well, but I really encourage you to find a typical structure that you are comfortable with and then make it your standard, make it your go-to way of starting a meeting. It really helps you feel more comfortable and more confident in the routineness of that structure. Once you jump into the content, you now have a lot of opportunity for things to go haywire. Hopefully that doesn't sound like a deficit approach to this, but there's a lot of opportunity that things can go wrong. Community meetings come with many pitfalls, and we're going to spend a little time today going over the most common ones. So this won't be all of them, but these are the most common as we have found. Those pitfalls you can see on the screen, they're going off agenda, meaning you start talking about other topics other than what you're intending to talk about for the meeting. And then there's time challenges and having a dense agenda or too much to process. Those two are really connected. So that's where you've got too much content, too much to talk about, and not enough time. How do you get through it all? And then there's dreaded technology issues. I'm sure you're all familiar with that. Your laptop won't work, your projector won't work, your microphone won't work, something's wrong there. And then the fourth pitfall is conflict. Sometimes conflict breaks out during the meeting, and it's awkward and not the way you want it to be, so we're going to talk about that. And then finally, the common pitfall is when participation levels vary greatly among meeting participants or uneven participation. So for each of these pitfalls, we're going to talk about how to take steps to prevent the pitfall from happening in the first place, And then, because nobody's perfect, we're going to talk about how to deal with it when it actually does crop up during the meeting, as these often will. So pitfall number one, getting off agenda. A group getting off agenda is very, very, very typical pitfall. That's why it's number one. Really, it's human nature to take a discussion wherever it flows. Unfortunately, that means that you may not accomplish the goals of your meeting if you don't stay on agenda. To help prevent getting off agenda, I really recommend sharing the agenda in advance. In fact, when I don't share my meeting agendas before the meeting, I often get 1 or 2 requests to do so from folks. People like knowing what they're walking into, frankly. I found that the sweet spot, though, for sending out the agenda is about a week before the meeting. If you send it out too much earlier than that, it gets lost in people's emails or on their desks. And if you send it out too much later, people might not get to it prior to the meeting, or they may have already felt some of the anxiety about not receiving it yet. If your meeting's an open public meeting, meaning you're inviting anyone interested to attend, it's always helpful to include the agenda in the invitation or post it to the website or your Facebook page, somewhere where folks can grab it. That way, those who you may not even know are going to attend will have access to it. I think the best way to start a meeting is reviewing the agenda, as we talked about previously. It allows you to set the stage for the topics at hand. It also lets you address what's not on the agenda, which may also help keep people on task. I usually say something like, you've probably noticed that X topic isn't on today's agenda. That's because we don't have enough time to discuss it with the focus it deserves, or something to that effect. I always end the agenda review with the question, how does this agenda fit with your expectations? Or does anyone think there's anything else that we need to cover today? It again shifts some of that leadership to the group so that they have a say in their own destiny. Lastly, if you keep the meeting moving from one agenda item to the next, it will make it harder to get off agenda. People can go off agenda by tiring of the topic or frankly just being bored. So keeping things moving will help decrease the opportunity for that to happen. I typically have timing mapped out on my personal agenda, meaning my agenda right in front of me, to help me give a framework from which I can work from in the meeting. But I don't often put the timing on the public agenda because it can cause anxiety if a topic moves too quickly or slowly. People tend to look at the agenda and think, oh no, we're off agenda. As long as you're able to pivot in the moment to adjust your timing, you should be okay. As one of the most prevalent pitfalls of running a meeting, you'll need to be prepared to manage getting off the agenda in the moment. It's gonna happen to you, I guarantee it. I'm often really transparent in meetings when I'm trying to bring people back on the agenda. Typically, I'll refer right back to the agenda in front of me and I'll say something like, let's get back to our agenda as we have a lot to cover. Or this is a really important topic you've brought up and I want to direct your attention to the agenda where it indicates we're going to talk about that topic later on in the meeting. You have to have a firm hand in what you're saying, but you've got to ensure you don't offend people. We'll talk more about setting up ground rules in a few minutes, but typically ground rules state something about staying on the agenda. So when that's the case, possibly others will take up the mantle to bring the group back on task. Otherwise, you can refer to the ground rules saying, remember that we agreed to stay on the agenda. I think we've gotten off track on this other really important conversation. I find it helpful not to make people think that you feel their discussion or comments aren't important. So I often acknowledge the importance of the other topic of their comments and ask if we should add the topic to a future agenda or put it in the parking lot. Speaking of parking lot, if you're not familiar with the parking lot concept, it's a place where you can put topics that need to be discussed, but not at the moment, not immediately. It's really a holding ground so that you don't lose the issue as the meeting progresses. I use a flip chart typically and write topics in large letters so everyone can see that their topic lives on, but for future discussion, not now. You'll have to figure out if the future is later in that meeting or in a separate opportunity. Everyone wants to make sure that their opportunity, that their comments are heard and followed up on. Finally, I mentioned earlier having a firm hand. You've got to be direct, but you've got to be professional. I've seen many meetings get permanently off agenda because the person running the meeting was too meek to stop it from happening. So you've got to summon up all of your courage and insert yourself where you can find an opening that doesn't cut anybody off. If you're like me, you'll probably pack your agendas full of information and sharing and discussing. I always think things will take less time than they do. Some might even say I'm overly ambitious. This typically results in a very dense meeting agenda, which is our second pitfall, causing time challenges. Often the topics that we discuss at community meetings are complex and nuanced. So those two adjectives usually translate into having time challenges in your meeting. I've learned to temper this personality trait of mine by doing a couple of things. If possible, I ask for feedback before the meeting so I can make adjustments to the agenda if folks feel that it's appropriate. You can share your agenda with your supervisor, a peer, a community partner. If these people have a sense for the topics at hand, they can point out if the agenda seems too packed or if you may want to rearrange items to help save time. You can also share the agenda with participants if you know who they will be beforehand, as we talked about earlier. This can help flag some problem areas that may be sticking points you didn't even know existed that will cause a discussion to last longer than you expected. You'll probably have some goals for your meeting, so it's helpful to revisit those goals so you can ask yourself what you're really needing to accomplish during the meeting. Make sure those items, the items that you really need to accomplish and decision points are on the agenda, and then other items can become deprioritized. You may get to them as time allows, but those are the first to go, frankly, when you have to scale your agenda back. It sort of goes without saying that you're going to need to schedule the appropriate time for topics you wish to cover, so don't try to cram a time-consuming conversation into too short of a time frame. I've done that. It never works. And then don't let process be the ruler over content. I'm sort of a type A person, so this can be a real challenge for me. I want to make sure I keep things moving, and that can come at the expense of a rich and thorough discussion, which is often critical to our work. So give people some room to communicate, some freedom, without feeling too boxed in with the agenda. As I mentioned, I often sketch out the timing for the meeting beforehand. It helps to think about it in chunks of time, at least it helps me to think about it that way. Like, we'll take 20 minutes for this topic and 30 minutes for that topic. Sometimes when you're on item 2 in your agenda and 45 minutes have passed, you start to panic. But sometimes that's completely appropriate for the content and the plan that you have, so you adjust accordingly. If it's possible to gather the same people together more than once, that gives you the opportunity to spread your topics across multiple agendas instead of just one. That's another way of preventing a dense agenda and having time challenges. Obviously, that's not always possible, but it allows you to ensure each topic has enough airtime for the group. I like to have someone serve as my timekeeper. You'll have some help in keeping the agenda on track then and ensuring you hit on every topic. Of course, if you have a timekeeper, you've got to share your timing that you mapped out beforehand and your expectations. This is another example of sharing leadership that I've been referring to. And lastly, to prevent having too dense an agenda, I like to send any materials I can before the actual meeting. This allows participants to review those items and saves time where people may just be reading the materials within the meeting. If you haven't given them beforehand, that turns into dead air in your meeting when you could be using that time for discussion or making decisions. You can't always send materials beforehand, so when that's the case, try to have really good materials available within the meeting so folks can refer to them for further information or details. Again, this saves time from figuring out how to communicate things in words that it can often be done or can often be better understood through charts and graphs and tables, things you could put together in a handout beforehand. Sometimes you're not able to prevent a dense agenda. This often happens to me as well. You might have one shot with these folks and you've got to get through what you've got to get through. There are some ways that you can manage that in the moment, though. To keep time challenges at bay in the moment, I start by revisiting the agenda. So I'll often say something along the lines of, we have a lot to cover yet in our agenda. We should decide how we want to proceed. It really helps folks pick up what you're putting down. Sometimes the discussion won't be finished and it's too important to move on without wrapping things up. So when that happens, I'll reform the agenda, meaning I'll move things around or I'll change the timing that I've planned. I almost always ask for feedback from the group when I do that, since I'm sharing leadership with them again. So I'll either ask for ideas to reform the agenda, or I'll pitch the group some of my ideas and ask if they agree or have some other thoughts. So my approach is something like, it's clear we still have some more discussion on this point, but we're running out of time. Might I suggest we remove the last item on the agenda to allow us the time to continue our conversation? And then I listen to what the participants say in response. It's really up to you to keep that agenda moving, so you won't have any time for lulls if you've got a dense agenda. If it sounds like people are winding the conversation down, it can be really helpful to summarize and just move on. Something like, so if I'm hearing the group correctly, you're saying we should consider expanding the mentoring program to 2 new neighborhoods that have the highest poverty rates. Is that a fair summary? Great, let's go to the next agenda item, so you keep things moving. I really value transparency. I think that comes into play with a dense agenda. Just be honest with the group that the agenda is packed up front and that you're going to have to ensure we move at a good pace. I'll say something like, we've got 3 more items on the agenda and about 20 minutes left. How are folks feeling about moving on? When I was an elected official, my colleague who ran our meetings would always ask, does anyone have anything new to add to the conversation? If not, we'll move on. This really helped us all refrain from restating thoughts that had already been expressed. As you probably have been able to tell, my style is pretty direct and honest, so I like to enlist help from meeting participants in solving the challenges we face in the meeting. If we're facing time challenges, I tell folks and then ask them how they want to move forward. Again, calling them all to solve the problem rather than you having to do it yourself. Sometimes things are just too much to solve within the meeting. Creating a subcommittee, sometimes called an ad hoc committee, is a great way to move the discussion out of the meeting, but also ensure that the issue doesn't die. I'll ask for 2 or 3 people willing to work on the issue outside of the meeting and bring recommendations back to the group. Again, that's only if your community meeting will be reconvened at some point. Even if you won't gather the people together again, the end outcome from the meeting might just be the formation of a subcommittee. That in itself might be a big win. I also recommend using multimedia to break up the agenda, since a dense agenda can get very tedious. I like a meeting where people can laugh and get to know each other a bit more. I think that's all about community building that VISTAs are called to do. Dense agendas usually squeeze these casual relationship building opportunities out of the meeting. You're basically all business when you've got a lot to do. So use multimedia to keep people's attention, which helps you move through the agenda faster. And finally, as we manage the dense agenda and time challenges in the moment, I always keep sticky notes with me for meetings. This is a little facilitation trick. I put them in the center of the table so people can use them throughout the meeting. And when you're running up against the clock, you can use the sticky notes as a great tool for gathering ideas and feedback without time-consuming conversation. The topic obviously has to be right for that tactic, but it's very effective for ensuring people feel heard and for cutting out time in your meeting. If you're going to meet a second time with the group, you can share the results of your data collection or just use it to inform your next steps if the community meeting is a one-and-done event. So I've been sharing my thoughts on community meetings with you for a while. I know you all have lots of experience and ideas as well, so we want to hear from you. I'm going to ask Andy to come back on and facilitate a scenario for all of you.
All right, thank you, Ryan. You'll see we've got a scenario here on the screen. I'm going to give you a little bit of information about it as well. And to participate in this, we're going to ask that you use the chat panel. If you haven't already reopened it, this is a good chance to do that now. So, and you can do that by clicking either the speech bubble icon in the upper right corner or the little triangle next to the word chat. All right, so here's the scenario. You're hosting a meeting that has heavily deviated from the agenda. The agenda was already packed full before you even started. And the participants have been talking for about 20 minutes on a different but still important topic. It's only tangentially related to the purpose of the meeting that you had set out. It's clear that you're running out of time, but your participants are fully engrossed and engaged in this other topic. What do you do? All right, so use the chat panel on the right side of the screen. Make sure that you're sending it to all participants and submit your comments. All right, so we've got a couple of comments in here already. David says, the topic appears to be important enough, so just roll with it. And Marie has a different view. She says she would request to table it for another time, for another meeting when it could be perhaps part of the agenda. So it looks like a couple folks are leaning in that direction. Seems like two camps are forming here. One says, hey, if they're really into it, let them go. It must be important. And the other says, well, gee, maybe this isn't the right time to do it, so maybe use a parking lot, get back to the agenda, and maybe cover this at another time. Just kind of scanning through to see if there are any other ideas. A couple of folks have talked about, engaging the group in the question to say, hey, let's just acknowledge what's going on and to see what the group wants to do and let them be involved in the decision-making around whether to table it or continue to go on. And somebody even said, maybe it's a barter and trade where, okay, if we're going to stick with this topic, something else comes off the agenda. So maybe the group can help decide what stays and what goes. All right, a lot of really good responses here. Ryan, what did you notice?
I really like this two camps issue. Not that either camp is right or wrong, but I really think this shows how much discernment is a skill that VISTAs have to develop, discerning whether we should roll with the topic because it's important, or discerning whether we should scale back and go back to the agenda, or even go to the participants and ask them for their thoughts. So I think you're picking up on this important piece that VISTAs have to develop, which will serve you in the long run in any career you choose, that issue of discernment. Well, let's pick up on our third pitfall then, the dreaded technology issues. I found that no matter how tech savvy you are, technology issues can still find you. Reduce the opportunity for tech issues by doing a dress rehearsal. This is a great way to prevent tech issues. Dress rehearsal, just like in the theater, it means you run through all of the things you will do with the technology before your actual meeting, outside of your meeting. You won't believe how many kinks in your plan you're going to find by doing this. Projectors with broken bulbs, different versions of software, internet firewalls, all sorts of things. If you find these things out beforehand, you can either change your plans or fix the problem. At the end of the day, it's really best to keep things as simple as possible in your meeting. So if tech issues do come up, it doesn't derail the entire meeting. It's nice to have all of the cool tricks that technology can bring, but with all of that comes, frankly, some risk. What's the least amount of complexity you can have in order to achieve your goals? That's really the question you should be asking yourself, and go with that as your plan. Even when you've done a dress rehearsal beforehand, it's important to get to your meeting space early enough to set up your equipment and test it again just prior to the meeting. It's also amazing what can happen between the time that you did your dress rehearsal and the actual meeting. If you're having others present or bring their own technology, it's really helpful to let them know up front what you're working with in terms of technology. Things like, will they have access to Wi-Fi in the meeting? Will they need to send you the presentation materials beforehand? Will you be doing any community input techniques that might require cell phones or cool technology like that? This one's caught me up a time or two where presenters have assumed that I'd have a lot of technology that I didn't end up having, and it makes everyone look bad in front of everyone. So something to avoid if you can. I'm really good with technology, actually, but sometimes it still gets the better of me. Don't be afraid or too proud to ask for help. I did a presentation just last month at a meeting at a hotel, and I know PowerPoint really well, and I know how to use a projector, and I'm adept at embedding videos in the presentation, but when I got to the hotel, everything was just a little different than I was used to. There was a different version of PowerPoint, and it was on a PC instead of a Mac like I use. There was a different projector. They had a special audio cable. Finally, I just bit the bullet and asked the in-house AV guy for some help, and in about 30 seconds, he had me back up and running. I wasted a ton of time because I felt inherently like I should be able to know how to do this, so my ego got the best of me. Don't be afraid to ask for help. Finally, to prevent tech issues, it's really best to have a plan B in case your technology completely fails. What if the projector just breaks? What if the internet signal goes down? How are you going to proceed without those items? It's sort of a worst case disaster scenario, but it's best to be ready for it because it will happen at some point in your career. Helping to manage those tech issues in the moment, if and when technology inevitably fails you, there's a couple of things you can do. First, since you did have that plan B ready, and if things fail, put that plan B into motion. You've already thought through this. You've already come up with how you're going to respond. You're ready for it, and you can seamlessly transition into your backup plan. I find it best not to mess too much within the meeting with technology that's not working. People become really impatient watching you try to retool a projector or find a file on your computer, and usually you become really frustrated. At least that's what happens to me, and then that can change the whole tone of the meeting in an instant. So give it your best quick attempt to fix it, and if you can't, bail out and move on. Just as getting help is a prevention method, it's also a way to manage things in the moment. If you're at a venue where someone is readily available to assist you, call them in. If you're not at a place where help is at your fingertips, go back to what I just said and bail out and move on. Finally, to help manage your tech issues in the moment, you can share the content that couldn't be utilized in the meeting, so people have access to the information. If you couldn't pull a website up to show your group, you can email them the link after the meeting. If you were using a computer to show files and somehow the computer crashed, you can send the files as an attachment later. Even your PowerPoint presentation that you thought you were going to show, you can send as an attachment. In fact, all of this stuff is what people like you to do regardless of whether you had technology fail, sending everything afterwards. It's just good meeting management and follow-up. So I want to transition to another chat scenario. So I'm going to ask Andy to come back on. I want to continue to apply some of the concepts that you're learning. So here's another scenario for you to consider, and this one has definitely happened to me.
All right, so same process. We'll use the chat panel on the right side of the screen for your response. So the scenario is you realize during setting up for the meeting that your laptop is not working. Your presentation and notes are all on the computer. So what do? Where do you go from here to get things back on track? Again, use the right side of the chat panel on the right side of your screen to brainstorm and think about what you can do when everything's on your laptop and your laptop isn't working. And I should mention, if you're participating on a mobile device, you can get to the chat, go to the participant screen, and look at the bottom. You'll see chat with everyone as an option there. All right, so we've got a couple of ideas coming in. Some of it, make sure you've got some kind of a backup, right? It's part of your plan B. You've printed notes out in advance, or you've made a copy of it and you've got it on a flash drive with you so you can borrow another computer and call it up. Other people say wing it, improvise, just make stuff up. I'm not sure how comfortable I am doing that, but I love the backup. For me, it's always kind of a security blanket. It's a confidence boost, so even if something starts to go a little bit wrong, I don't freak out because I know I've got a backup, and usually that helps me figure out in the moment how to get things to work again. Let's see. Another version of the backup is, of course, using the cloud. So again, if there's another computer, you can use a Google Drive or some other cloud-based storage. And this is very real. Marie shares it happened to her just yesterday. So very real. Ryan, what else did you notice here?
I saw that Stephanie made the comment to make a joke, and that was definitely something I was going to say. You really have to be able to laugh at yourself and laugh it off and just be honest with people and say, oh, the technology is being like technology is, because frankly, everyone else has been in this situation, so have a good laugh at the situation. And I love the idea of having things printed out, and on PowerPoint it's really easy to print your slides beforehand and you can work with that. And, it's really helpful just to be familiar with your material so you don't have to wing it, so you can start talking and discussing with the group without your notes or without the technology. So great suggestions from all of you. Thank you. I can tell that that is a pretty prevalent pitfall. Well, let's move on to our fourth pitfall. It's really conflict and interpersonal conflict during the meeting, frankly. There's always a chance for conflict in a meeting, especially if the participants don't know each other well. It's easier to misunderstand someone when you don't know them. So remember that appropriate conflict can be good. It helps avoid groupthink. It brings up a diversity of opinion. But it's got to be managed professionally and should be solution-oriented rather than problem-creating. To prevent conflict, I like to use icebreakers. I know everyone's rolling their eyes in the back of their head right now because everybody hates icebreakers, but face it, they do what you need them to do. It helps participants get to know each other better, and as they get to know each other better, it's harder for them to make assumptions about their intentions. So get the folks talking, get them knowing each other's names so they start to build relationships that help make conflict less prevalent. I find that focusing on shared goals instead of what divides us is always helpful. Hopefully everyone is aiming at the same target. That's why they came to the meeting to discuss the issue. And when we focus what we agree on, it helps deprioritize those items that we don't agree on. It's probably a lesson for the world right now. I'm also a big fan of creating ground rules to help guide the meeting. I mentioned this in a previous pitfall and told you we'd get to talking about ground rules. Sometimes these are called community standards or operating principles or meeting rules, whatever you want to call them. Basically, the group agrees on how it will work together. Typically, the group comes up with things like don't talk over one another and assume positive intentions and have a sense of humor. If you establish these ground rules up front, it will help guide the conflict that comes up so that it doesn't become disruptive. I've talked a lot about sharing leadership. That's a really important concept for VISTAs to learn. You've heard me mention it a couple of times. It's really in that community empowerment pillar that VISTA values so highly. Where others feel like they have leadership and ownership of the outcome, it becomes then their responsibility to diminish and manage conflict. Thus, it's not always your job to police the conflict. Where there's shared leadership, everyone is accountable to police that conflict. Shared leadership begins with the establishment of those ground rules. It's not you issuing the rules to the group, it's the group governing themselves. You can ask people to take on roles. We talked about this, such as timekeeper. You can have someone be the note taker, et cetera, whatever you might need within the meeting so that participants can take on a responsibility that, again, turns into ownership of the meeting. That responsibility and ownership helps participants to feel able and willing to help de-escalate conflict as it comes up. And then finally, one of the tools that I use to help diminish conflict is seat assignments. And this only works when you know about participants prior to the meeting. Sometimes I know that person A and person B don't get along, so I'll purposefully seat them away from each other. This sounds childish, but it happens in adult meetings all the time. There's also a lot of power dynamic that can be shifted by seating arrangements, so I obviously encourage you to use these powers only for good, of course. When you're seated in a circle or a square, the person who's seated directly across from you is in what's considered a power position. They're the person you look at the most, and they'll probably be the one you call on the most to give you comments and to ask their questions because they're right in your line of vision. The people, though, that are to your immediate left or right are in the weaker positions in the room because you don't tend to turn your head 90 degrees too often, so you don't see their expressions, you can't read the room, so to speak, and sometimes you'll even miss if they're raising their hand. I'm sure we could do a whole webinar on seating assignments and nonverbal communication like this, but I'll just leave it at that and hope that those pieces help you. We'll refer back to that in a few minutes, too. So even if you work hard to prevent conflict, it will inevitably pop up every now and again, and you've got to be ready to manage them. When things get really heated in a meeting, I suggest you just take a break. Give everyone a 10 to 15-minute break to get some water, take a walk, use the restroom, and frankly, chill out. This usually helps de-escalate the conflict. If you've ever been in a conflict, you know that once that immediate tension is broken, it helps to bring you back to the world where you often realize that you got caught up in something and helps either you back down or you deal with it in a different way. Where you've made ground rules, again, this is a good time to revisit them to help manage conflict in the moment. I like to print my ground rules on the agenda so that everyone can see them as a reminder of what they'd agreed to, but that only works when you have a group that meets regularly again. Where you have a group that's coming together for the first time and maybe for the only time, I like to use flip chart again for the ground rules so that they can stay posted and visible for the entire meeting. It allows not just you but others in the meeting to say things like, hey, remember we agreed to assume good intentions of each other's comments, which hopefully can help de-escalate conflict. Sometimes I like to use the concept of naming the conflict outright. Oftentimes, conflict stems from misunderstanding. When you ask people to actually name the conflict, literally to say what you're disagreeing with, it often leads to clarity that perhaps folks weren't so far separated in their thoughts or opinions in the first place. So I use language like, I feel some tension around this issue, but I'm not sure I'm clear on what the disagreement is about. Can someone clarify for me what this discussion is about? It's neutral and it's innocent to say something like that and usually helps break people out of their fighting stance. Finally, as we talked about with prevention of conflict, sharing leadership is also a good way to encourage everyone to help mitigate conflict and share that responsibility in the moment. So when two people start to disagree and it escalates beyond the professional, others in the meeting, again, feel empowered to refer back to the ground rules or the shared goals of the group that the group identified. So I want to move on to our last pitfall. Our last pitfall we'll discuss is about personality traits of those in the meeting. So while different personalities bring strength through diversity for sure to our group, it also means that participation around the table can be a bit uneven. So some of these personalities include what I call the silent Bob. This is definitely a 1990s reference for anyone who's following it, but I use it here to refer to the person in the meeting who doesn't say a peep. Sometimes you forget they're even in the meeting because they are seemingly not offering anything to the conversation. These can be introverted people or those new to their job or new to the community or just someone unfamiliar with the topic. Dominating Dennis is a shout out to my father. Please don't tell him. His name is Dennis. Dominating Dennises tend to overpower other voices. They've got lots to say about every topic and often are the first and the last person to speak. This really often has the effect of suppressing other people's participation. Negative Nancy is another friend of mine. It's a pretty familiar term for most of us. This person finds the cloud in every sky. They are skeptical, they are suspicious, they often bring up problems without any solutions. Frankly, they can suck all of the excitement out about a project or a topic out of the meeting. And finally, a personality that might show up in your meeting is Chatty Cathy. It's also a pretty familiar term. That person's got lots to say, but it isn't always on topic. They're usually bubbly and friendly and very, very likable, but can have lots of time to otherwise straightforward topics. So now that I've presented all of these stereotypes in a pretty negative fashion, perhaps I'm being a rejecting Ryan, but all of these folks have unique strengths they bring to the table as well. Part of preparing to deal with these personalities is finding the positive in those personality traits that each individual brings to the meeting. There are some strategies to preventing uneven participation, or to put it in a more asset-based term, there are some strategies to ensure balanced participation in your meeting. Doing the dreaded icebreakers, again, is a great way to start building relationships between people. Again, as people get to know each other, it's harder and harder to take their personalities to the extreme. Get people comfortable with each other, get them talking, get them laughing. Assigning those meeting roles that we've referenced a couple of times already helps ensure people are engaged to an appropriate degree. So you can ask the dominating dentist to take notes. That may help temper his personality a bit, since he'll have to be writing or typing throughout the meeting and just won't have the ability to talk as much. You can ask a negative Nancy to be the scribe for your flip charts, as that will require her to put all ideas, even the bad ones that she'll point out, up on the wall for consideration. She'll find it less and less appropriate to criticize ideas if she's responsible for putting them up on the flip chart. Coming back to seat assignments, those are a great way to help with help even the participation around the table. Again, we could do a whole session on nonverbal communication, but we don't have the time today. Here's a few tips. Put silent Bobs right across from you. The eye contact that you'll make with them will invite response from him, and you'll be more apt to call on him because he's directly in your line of sight, as we discussed. Put dominating dentists immediately to your right and left. They'll be out of your natural eye line, again, which will make it harder for him to claim the floor. And for Chatty Cathy's, you can put them next to Silent Bob or next to people she doesn't know. She won't get the engagement from those people that will keep her chatting. Now, all of this is only helpful if you know something about the people coming in the room, which is obviously not always the case. Another helpful tip if you know something about the people in the room is to have chats with them prior to the meeting. So I'll pull a dominating dentist aside before the meeting and find gentle ways to ask him to take a back seat. I'll call up a Silent Bob before the meeting, and I'll ask them to have a voice. I'll ask them for their help, frankly, in having a voice to their issues, sort of push them to participate more. And for Chatty Cathy's, you can ask them for their help in keeping the agenda on track and on moving, so they'll be less apt to be chatty. And for a negative Nancy, I might ask her to bring some ideas to the table that she'll have something to champion, not just something to poke holes in. So you can talk to them prior to the meeting if you know a little bit about them. Lastly, an old camp trick might help even the participation out. If you bring a talking stick, if you think some of these personalities might show up at your meeting, you may want to just hyper-manage the meeting by bringing a talking stick. Really, this can be any object. It doesn't have to be a stick, but only the person who holds the object can speak. It's sort of a drastic measure for your meetings, but it might be necessary. I also like to use this as a management tool for in the moment, not just prevention. So I'll keep it with me like I keep the sticky notes and bring it out if I need to. So again, one last time, I want to continue to hear how you'd apply some of these concepts about uneven participation. to a real-life situation, except you'll notice in this moment we haven't explored managing uneven participation in the moment like we did with the other pitfalls prior to our chats. But I'm willing to bet that you all have some great ideas for how to do this, some that I might mention in the next few slides. So here's our last scenario from Andy.
All right, so once again, we'll use the chat panel on the right side. So imagine that you are facilitating or leading a meeting, and between a negative Nancy and a dominating Dennis, the morale in the meeting has really taken a nosedive. Every suggestion is met with criticism or tense silence. You really need to get the group to make a decision on how your project should move forward. At this point, it's pretty clear you won't get what you need from the meeting, and you doubt that anyone would return for a second helping of this mess. How do you move forward? So again, please use the chat on the right side of the screen, and we will look for your responses there. And again, if you're using a mobile device, go to the participants pane, scroll way to the bottom, and click on Chat with Everyone, and you'll be able to participate that way. All right, so we've got a few already here. Ellie has a ground rule about step up, step back. I think that's probably a more general approach. Let's see. Clarissa, give a reminder about being productive and then call on people selectively to get the kinds of responses that you want or that you think will be more positive or productive. That's great. Crystal, take a break. Very good. You remembered that from one of our prior pitfalls. A couple people refer to the break. Great. Yeah, reminding people about the purpose of the meeting, going back to the ground rules, or the meeting agreements, the group agreements. Very good. Yeah, a couple of you have noticed, and I've noticed as well, that the WebEx chat is being a little, it's freezing, and then it's just being a little uncooperative right now. Let's see. Sarah has a great suggestion to just kind of call it out and say, sort of as you were suggesting earlier, Ryan, she's like, is there an issue going on here? I've noticed something here. Can you tell me a little bit more about what's going on and why we're getting stuck? All right. So more ideas are coming. Again, it's taking just a second for my window to refresh. Yeah, so Abla has a suggestion if they're kind of two different sides of an argument to maybe try to find a middle way between the two sides. Aiden says, yeah, reminding the group of accomplishments is a great idea. So lots of different suggestions here. One that's coming up a lot is the break. Using a break strategically to refocus people, and then I'm guessing having some clear instruction for what you want to do or what you hope the team will do when you come back from the break. So Ryan, what did you notice here?
Thanks, Andy. I noticed a lot of folks saying take a break as well. I think that's really smart advice. What I might do in this moment, in this particular scenario, is take a break, and while everyone sort of cools off and tries to communicate more on an interpersonal level, I would probably reform the agenda to switch how we do the rest of the agenda to ensure that we get to the goals that we have shared. And maybe that's just folks working by themselves within the meeting, coming up with ideas so they don't even have to interact with each other, but trying to salvage what we can from the meeting. Thanks so much for all of those suggestions. You're going to hear me repeat some of your suggestions here, if a little bit briefer because you mentioned it, as we talk about how to manage uneven participation in the moment, because you guys are great. You hit on a lot of these. Using the ground rule, someone definitely mentioned that in the chat, is really helpful to manage uneven participation in the moment. They almost always include something about speaking one at a time or speaking up. I might say something like, remember our ground rules, we wanted to ensure that everyone is heard. I sometimes will turn discussions, this is sort of like reforming the agenda as I just mentioned, but sometimes I'll turn discussions into a think, pair, share. So quiet people will have a chance to work with one or two partners to contribute. It's less pressure than a full audience. And the think, pair, share, if you're not familiar, is a prompt that you give the group some topical question that they think about, and then they join with one other person that makes the pair, and then they share their thoughts with each other. Sometimes that's then followed up by a larger group debrief, and then sometimes it just stays as a discussion between the two of them. It's a good way to break up the meeting and also a good way to get quieter people to participate. Sometimes I want everyone to say something, so I'll use what I call an around the world prompt. Around the world is where a question is posed and you literally go around the room for responses. It gently forces participation, so I'll frame it by saying something like, I'd really like to hear from everyone on this topic, so let's go around the room so each of you can respond. It's helpful to make these prompts really brief, though, because it takes a lot of time. Maybe even tell them to limit their answer to one word, something that they can respond to. How are you feeling about this topic in one word? Because you want, when you make everyone respond, it does take more time. I've got some phrases that are sort of go-to options for me when one of our extreme personalities shows up. It's strategic language, like, let's hear from someone whose voice we haven't heard on this. That tells folks that have been talking a lot, hey, your turn has passed. Or something like, let's all take the opposite opinion and brainstorm what those points might be. It helps turn a negative Nancy around as well. They really help subtly send the message that you're trying to get across to the participants. Lastly, I like to use multiple methods of input that aren't so beholden to people's personality. So things like flip charts, as I've mentioned, sticky notes we've mentioned, verbal prompts, show of hands, dot voting, et cetera, on and on. That helps get folks engaged in different ways. So that wraps up our focus on pitfalls, but I do want to talk about bringing your meeting to a close before we bring our meeting to a close. Concluding the meeting can itself turn into a pitfall when you're running a meeting. Here's some tips on the screen to bringing your gathering to an end. You're going to need to reclaim the floor. Since the meeting is most likely or should most likely be about hearing from others and not from you, typically you won't do as much of the talking. So you're going to need to reclaim the floor in order to start the conclusion of the meeting. I say something like, well, folks, we've come to the end of our time together, and I want to be kind to your schedules. We'll have to start wrapping up. It sends that note to folks that it's time to wind down the discussion. Then, once you've done that, it's time to summarize the key points. I literally use my agenda, and I walk back through our discussion, hitting only on the very high-level key points, not rehashing entire discussions. A part of that process is reviewing agreed-upon next steps and assigned tasks as you walk through the agenda. I'll say something like, Dennis, Kathy, and Nancy agreed to form a subcommittee to discuss this issue further. Or, Bob, you volunteered to send us your sample document that you use in your office. This helps remind people what they said they'd do, which can be forgotten in the meeting. It can get lost in a very full meeting. It also helps your note taker, if you have one, put all of the action items promised in a meeting in one place in the notes, which is helpful for you and for others. So once all of that is complete, I always ask for any brief last thoughts or comments. Keyword there is brief. You don't want to rehash any of the items, but you do want to give folks an opportunity to add any appropriate thoughts. I'm often teased in my office that I have good ideas, but they're always too late. So by asking for last thoughts from participants, it gives people a chance to add any good ideas that came to them after you've moved on from that topic, but still within an appropriate time frame for their comments. If it's necessary or appropriate to have another meeting, this is a good time to determine when that meeting will be. Sometimes, though, this process is impossible to do in the moment, especially with a lot of people in the room. So I'll use Doodle or some other web tool to to find a common available date and time to meet. I also use this chance to ask if there are others that weren't included or didn't get an invitation to this meeting, if we should then invite them to future meetings, making sure everyone's in the room who needs to be there. And then don't forget to thank everyone for coming. Again, giving their time is a tremendous gift, and you should recognize that effort. And then finally, you actually have to adjourn the meeting. People, in their manners, usually wait until the host has said something that releases them before they get up to go. They don't want to be rude. I'll often see people clutching their materials, looking at me, hoping that I will say something like, okay, meeting adjourned, before they get up and go, because they have good manners. So even though the meeting ends, it doesn't mean your responsibilities are going to end. You'll want to make sure that you gather all the notes, the flip charts, the sticky notes, etc., all of the things that you've produced in the meeting, so you can follow up as appropriate or keep track of what happened in the meeting. Then you're going to actually have to do the follow-up, especially if you promise to do so, distributing notes and resources, taking next steps that you promised. I'm telling you, following up is a completely underrated action. When someone comes to a meeting and doesn't hear anything afterwards, they wonder if their time spent was for naught. You won't get their time again in the future if they felt that way about your meeting. So be the all-star VISTA that you are, that I know you are, and make sure you follow up after your meetings. And then be sure to take the appropriate next steps. So those are either next steps in your VAD for the project or next steps that you agreed to in the meeting. And then finally, after the meeting, I like to send thank yous to people if possible. Again, their time is so precious. I want them to feel engaged by me, and I actually send them thank you cards through the U.S. mail. Nobody does that anymore, so it makes them stand out, and people feel really appreciated and noticed when they read it. They know you've gone to extra links to make sure they feel appreciated. I find it helpful when looking back on a webinar topic to pick out some really tangible tools and resources. Today we talked about several tools in passing that I think are helpful that we should probably call out on their own. So I've chosen 10 meeting tools that I think will be helpful for you. Your agenda is perhaps the most important of those tools. It helps keep you on track, it helps you plan out your thoughts, and helps you communicate with your participants. We talked about ground rules a lot. They really help keep the meeting productive, help share leadership with those who attend your meeting, helps manage conflict. Do this activity, the activity of setting ground rules, up front in your agenda. We talked about prepped materials. Those are helpful for managing a dense agenda and can help ensure people show up to the meeting if they see the materials and they think, wow, this is quite the topic, I need to make sure I show up and participate. That fourth bullet there, we didn't talk a lot about data today, but it's certainly a key tool for your meeting management. It helps inform decisions and eliminate myths. I really encourage you to use data in your prepared materials or as a handout at the meeting. Speaking of handouts, they're the fifth bullet, the fifth great meeting tool. They're a great way of helping to move the meeting agenda along and showing that you're prepared and frankly that you know your stuff. Our sixth bullet is visual aids, including PowerPoint. They really help professionalize your meeting, and just like the handouts, they help to move the agenda toward understanding and decision-making. Name tags help people start to build relationships. We've mentioned that a great deal on this session. At the very least, it allows people to call each other by their names, which is important. There's lots of icebreakers you can do that involve name tags, too, that are pretty simple. We talked about icebreakers. Those are the activities that help your meeting participants get to know each other better. These help reduce conflict and balance the voices at the table, two of our potential pitfalls we focused on today. I mentioned sticky notes a couple of times today because they're quite the adaptive pocket-sized solution to several problems. I literally keep them in my bag at all times in case I need them. So if I'm ever at a meeting and I need them, I'll have them right with me. Everyone is familiar with sticky notes, so it's a non-threatening tool for the group that you can use pretty easily. And then finally, food, my favorite perhaps of all meeting tools, perhaps of all tools that exist. Food helps relax people, it calms them, it tends to help make things more casual. It also entices people to show up, and that's really important. So as you reflect on these 10 tools, I hope they'll come in handy for you as you plan and run your own community meetings. Other resources, really great resources, are on the VISTA campus, including tips for running an effective meeting. There's sample icebreakers on the campus. There's a webinar on planning an effective meeting and a handout on handling conflict, among many, many more that would help support the topics that we discussed today. So that's it for me in terms of content, Vistas. Thanks for your attention and your really great chat participation around the scenarios. I really enjoyed reading how you would approach those situations. So now I look forward to your questions. But before we turn to questions, I'm going to ask Andy to tell you how to evaluate the webinar because we value your voice so much.
All right. Ryan, thank you so much for all of this great content. And as he mentioned, we do have a poll. It's an evaluation, 10 quick questions for you to give us feedback, what you thought about the presentation. And if you have ideas for other types, other topics for webinars that we could offer, we definitely look at all of these results and read all your ideas. 10 questions, you'll need to use the scroll bar on the right so you can see all of them. Once you've done it, be sure to click the submit button in the bottom right corner so that your responses will be recorded. All right, so having said that, the poll will remain open. It is now time to get to your questions. Ryan's given you a lot of content, a lot of information to think about, and I'm sure that may have generated some questions for you. We've got 2 ways that you can ask a question. One, of course, is in the Q&A panel, which is collapsed now. It's right above the poll, but you can open it back up to submit your question online. And I'm going to invite our operator, Robin, to come back on and give us instructions for asking a question by phone.
And thank you. At this time, to ask a question by the phone, please press star followed by the number 1. Please unmute your line and record your name clearly as prompted so that I'll be able to introduce you. Again, at this time, if you have a question from the phone line, please press star followed by the number 1.
All right, thank you for that. And while we're waiting for any of you on the phone to call in with your question, we've got a couple that have come in through the Q&A. So David asked, how many people would make an adequate subcommittee? So I don't really have any more information about that. David, if you're on the line, you might want to pop another question into the Q&A to give us a little more detail, maybe say a little bit more about what kind of committee it is, what it is they're tasked to do, or what their role is, because that might give Ryan some ideas about that. But absent any more detail, Ryan, do you have any thoughts about how many people make for an effective committee?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I typically think the subcommittee should be 15 to 20% of the larger committee. Now, in a really large group, that makes a really large subcommittee that can be difficult. So you'll have to have some wiggle room there to make that decision. But if you've got 25 or 30 people, I think having 8 to 10 people, 8 to 12 people on a subcommittee is appropriate. You don't want probably fewer than 3. That's less a subcommittee and more of 2 people working on things or someone assigned a task themselves. I really like a group of between 5 and 10, but again, if you've got a bigger main group, a bigger community meeting that you're creating a subcommittee from, you may want to have a larger subcommittee so that you're getting a good taste of all of the diverse opinions and ideas in the room to influence the decisions and the content of the subcommittee.
All right, great. Yeah, and oftentimes it depends on the resources that people you have to work with. I've been involved with boards and committees, and sometimes even though maybe we had space for more people, we couldn't always recruit enough to fill some of those slots. So sometimes, even if it's not ideal, you go with what you've got. Let's see. I don't see any other. Okay, wait. Where's? Let me go back here. Okay, so Ozak says, I'm wondering if you have tips on running a community meeting where the participants are all much older than you, and they may not take you to be an authority.
Yeah, welcome to my life as a young professional. I think that's a great question. So some of the things that I typically try to do is know my stuff in and out, be well read and well versed on the issue. I try to talk to people prior to having a meeting, again, if that's possible, so I can get to know them and build a rapport with them. They can start to trust me because they see that I know my stuff. There's also silly things, and I say silly because in the grand scheme of things they're silly, but they're important in the moment, like making sure you dress appropriately for the meeting. So I'm still a relatively young professional, so when I go to meetings with people who probably do know a lot more than I do and who are a lot older than me, I wear a suit so that they see that I'm taking this seriously and can see me more as a peer if that's possible. And then frankly, if you think that that's going to be a barrier to getting the outcomes that you're looking for, you may have to tag somebody else in to lead the meeting. I sort of hate that thought to say that we're going to give in to the prejudice of the community, but at the end of the day, if you're trying to get to the solution that you're trying to get to, it might be best to have your supervisor lead a meeting or ask an outside facilitator to come in and then have you participate as a peer with the rest of the people in the room. Hopefully that's helpful.
Great. Thank you, Ryan. Nicole had a very similar question, so I think you've covered that as well. Another one, kind of different, not so much about running the meeting, but maybe setting it up. John asks, should your meetings be invitation only or maybe open for people to bring others along? So thoughts about the invitation list or keeping it exclusive?
Yeah, I think this is all directed by the type of meeting, the topic of the meeting, what you're trying to achieve. So if you're serving in a Parks and Rec department and you want to hear lots of community feedback on how to use the vacant lot in the neighborhood. If you're a Parks and Rec fan, you'll get the reference there. You'll want to get as many people to come to your meeting as possible to have as much voice from the community as possible. But then there are going to be times where you're talking about a very specific issue, perhaps a complex issue that's been worked on for several months or even several years, that have key people in the community that you'll want to seek their input or have a discussion with. Then you might want to go invitation only. Sometimes, and I actually did this yesterday, I hosted a meeting of community leaders here in Michigan, and this is a meeting that happens twice a year, semi-annually. So these folks relatively know each other, but because of the topic that we were discussing particular to this meeting, I poked people, I sort of invited them to invite somebody else from their organization who might be interested in the topic to come along with them in the car ride and participate in the meeting, because there are other people at their organization that might be interested in the topic. So I very specifically said to folks, because of the topic, you might want to bring the people in your organization that deal with X issue primarily. So you really got to evaluate what you're trying to achieve and who you're trying to reach out to.
All right, let's turn to the phones and see if we have any callers online with questions.
At this time, I'm seeing no questions, but as a reminder, if there is any questions from the phone line, to please press star followed by the number 1.
All right. Back to the WebEx Q&A. Tracy says, it's hard to step back and let someone else facilitate your meeting when we're being tasked to accomplish what we need to accomplish through our VAD. It's a big sell of the VISTA program when we are tasked with tackling serious issues. So it's not really a question there, but maybe more of a comment. Or maybe there's a question involved in there around getting, how do we engage someone else in facilitating our meeting when really the outcome is so vital to what we do.
Yeah, Tracy, I hear you. Part of why you do VISTA is to build your own portfolio, to build your own skill set, build your resume, and I think those are all very appropriate things to want to get out of the experience. And so it can be hard to let go of control. I think you have to ask yourself, who best is there to lead the meeting? Is bringing in an outside expert the best thing you can do for the community? And to achieve the goals of your VAD, then that's probably the right decision. And that doesn't mean you know any less or are less talented, but it actually, I think, shows a professionalism and, again, that discernment skill of figuring out what's best for the community. But I totally agree. Where you feel competent enough, where you feel able enough, knowledgeable enough to lead the meeting, even if it's a complex issue, even if you're super young and everyone else is really old, you give it a try. Absolutely. This is part of why you're there. You were brought on, you were chosen and onboarded for a reason. You've got some talent. So please don't hear me saying that you as young professionals, if that's what you are in the VISTA world, should not take a stab at these things. I feel exactly the opposite. This is your year of service. You want to make it great. You just want to make sure you're serving the community appropriately and reaching the end outcome in your VAD appropriately. If you can say that you're doing that with both of those things, show your leadership skills, girl.
All right, great. Thank you for that. Let's see, a couple other questions come in. Emily asked, what if I'm leading a meeting and someone says something that really upsets me? What can be an appropriate action to take at that moment?
That's a great question. This has happened to me a couple of times, and most of the time that it has happened, I've sort of stopped, taken a deep breath, and I've clarified what I've heard, because sometimes, and we talked about this with conflict, right? It's merely a misunderstanding. So I'll say something like, is this what you're saying, or am I hearing you correct and you're saying this or asking this, to make sure that what I'm hearing and what I'm picking up on is what they intend. Oftentimes it's not, and the person will say, oh, no, that's not what I meant this, and then we're able to move on. But sometimes, especially in sort of heated government issues, when I was an elected official, people look you right in the eye and they say, yeah, that is exactly what I was saying. And so I think you have to decide what the most professional thing to do there is. Typically I use a phrase like, well, I disagree with how you're coming at that. Here's my experience and here's what I'm learning from. Stating that I disagree to make sure I'm being true to myself and my own ethics and morals and values, but doing so in a professional way, and then backing up my thought process and my views. Not in a debate way, because going tit for tat really usually makes everybody look bad, but simply acknowledging that you have a disagreement and stating your own opinion, and then frankly the people around the room can decide who they agree with. If your reasoned response makes them say, yeah, you're probably the one that I trust and agree with on this issue, or perhaps it's an angry crowd, and I face those as well, and they agree with the other person. It helps to de-escalate the issue, though. There's been several times where I've had to talk to somebody after a meeting, so dealt with it professionally in the meeting, but then pulled someone aside and sort of I'll say had it out. I don't mean unprofessionally had it out, but say like, you know, where are you coming from on this? And even if my feelings were hurt or I took offense, I'll just use that language and say, boy, when you said that, my feelings were really hurt. So I want to come to solution. I want to come to a place where we can continue to work together. Again, being solution oriented and not just looking for a yelling match.
All right. Let's go one more time to the phones to see if we have any callers with questions.
And thank you. At this time, I'm seeing no questions. As a reminder, it is star followed by number 1.
All right. We've got just a couple minutes left and not really enough time to do justice to this question, which is a big one. Ivory asks, how do you deal with issues of racism that surface in a community meeting? So, Ryan, not sure if in 2 or 3 minutes you're able to give some ideas about how you might approach that, but I'm going to put that out there for you.
Oh, Ivory, if I could solve racism in 2 or 3 minutes, I would be a very wise man. So I don't want to claim that I can do that, but certainly this happens in meetings. Again, I've tried to treat people with respect where that comes up, and I firmly state that I disagree with them, and I state why I disagree with them. And I say things like, you know, I try to not make bold proclamations about any one group of people. I don't think that that's helpful, and try to steer the person away from the bold comments that they're making. Typically, you're not going to change anybody's mind in the meeting, especially in front of folks. People tend to dig in, and so that's another time I might try to engage with somebody on the sidelines. And if it's enough people and it happens enough times in meetings, I might think about doing some sort of anti-racism training, diversity training, something, offering that for the group individually or offering it widely for the community to help get to those root causes where you actually can, I think, change minds on this issue. It's really hard in the moment, though. So, you know, I feel really strongly on this issue, so I make sure everyone in the room knows exactly how I feel, why I feel it that way, why I feel that way. And if it's bad enough, frankly, I'll say that's not the type of thing where we're going to discuss in this meeting. That's not the type of view that I think most of us in this room have, and I'll try to leverage sort of the peer pressure of the rest of the group to say, no, nobody's agreeing with you on what you just said, dude. We need to move on. And that's really the best that I've been able to do in a meeting. I was in one meeting once, and we were talking about HIV/AIDS crisis, and this isn't the same as racism, but it's in the same family. And a woman piped up and said, we really need to talk to the community about the fact that AIDS can be spread by sneezing, and AIDS can be spread through saliva. And you could see everyone sort of take a deep breath and sit back in their chairs like, whoa, that's not right. And in that moment, we had some experts in the room that I could turn to and give us data and real tools and real world experience and research to disprove that. I think there is a similar thing that you could do. Usually racism, I shouldn't say usually, oftentimes racism rears its head in folks giving false data like, all black people this, all Hispanic people that. If you've got some experts in the room, deferring to them to talk about the actual data in the community helps take all the air out of that bubble, because the comment is shown is not true. Hopefully that's helpful, Ivory. I wish I could be more helpful in that vein in my own community as well as yours.
All right. Great job with that, Ryan, and great job with the whole presentation and all the great content and information you've provided. We have come to the end of our time together, so I just want to give a shout out again to Ryan Fewens-Bliss, who is, among many other things, one of our National VISTA trainers, as well as an elected official. And also to our production team at Education Northwest for their support in producing today's presentation. I want to thank all of you for participating, and also invite you to join our next webinar, which I think may be of interest to some folks here. It's on using assertive communication to establish your credibility. So that topic came up a couple of times. Watch your inbox for announcements about these upcoming materials and webinars, and we hope to see you again soon. Thank you so much.